So let me begin with a story. In 1980, Pat Lawler, at the age of 24, he's the gentleman on the far right, became the head of Youth Villages, a small residential treatment facility for troubled kids. Kids that had been involved in the criminal justice system, kids that came from troubled homes. And he was charged with turning it around. It was having some difficulties. At the time, it served 25 kids. Over the course of 6 years of hard work, he actually grew the program to serve 80 kids. So in many ways, you might call this a success. But as Pat was working with these kids and working in this program, he had this lingering concern that, in fact, the program might not be effective. And that was because he kept seeing kids coming back through the program. And when he and his staff started to gather data on this, indeed, that was confirmed. And it really sent him on a search to figure out, where are there programs that are effective? What would it actually take to change the trajectory of these kids' lives? And in doing that search, literally over the course of a couple of years, he found a program called multisystemic therapy, which was quite different than what Youth Villages did. It actually kept kids in their homes, surrounded with their families, surrounded by a set of supports to enable them to get on a different path with their lives. And Youth Villages then adopted this program, and over the last 20 years has had an extraordinary track record of impact with this program. For example, it has double the outcomes of comparable programs measured by the frequency with which kids end up back in the state system. But what's even more remarkable, it actually does that at only 1/3 the cost. So you have this extraordinary program that has double the impact, 1/3 of the cost, and it's partially why, with some additional investments, partially why Youth Villages has grown over the last 20 years to be in 12 states and serve 10,000 kids. 10,000 kids in 12 states. So really an extraordinary track record. Now, when you put Youth Villages against the nature of the problem it's seeking to serve, it's a little bit sobering, because even with that growth and that success, it still serves only 2 out of 100 kids that could benefit from this program. So while it's very, very promising, there's still a big gap to fill. Now, when I talked to Pat Lawler last month, he told me some things that made me think that this is a story still unfolding and one that might not have a happy ending. Because as I talked to him about what was happening with Youth Villages at the state level, he said state by state, they're fighting tooth and nail to just maintain their market share, despite the tremendous need, despite lower costs, despite greater results. It's no guarantee that they actually win contracts. And in fact, they're winning some, but they're losing some. So what's going on? Well, we read about it in the papers every day. We see it as I travel around the country to different states and different cities. The local papers are all about the state budget cuts. The presidential debates are talking about sequestration and the federal budget debt crisis. Whoever's the next president's going to have to deal with some really tough decisions right away. So you have this enormous pressure right now bearing down on organizations like Youth Villages, which leading them to be in this situation. Now, when I asked Pat, again, what was going on? What on the ground is happening with all of this pressure? He said that over the last few years, when he thought about what it takes to win a contract, it was basically 50% results and 50% relationships. And he said in the last year, with increased pressure, it's about 30% results and 70% relationships. At the very time you would think, with economic pressures, we would be searching and investing in things that work. In fact, relationships are trumping results. And this is what we really need to figure out how we change. Now, let me just pull back the camera so that we can think a little bit more broadly about the problem. If you think about the federal budget, about $3.6 trillion, you take out entitlements, you take out defense, you take out interest rates. There's a chunk of money that goes to discretionary programs like Youth Villages. Let's call that $250 billion. Of that, a portion of that we know has evidence of the impact of those programs. Call that 10 to 15%. I'd say these numbers are challenging because we don't actually know, except for very specific studies on things, what the total would look like. It doesn't mean the rest of that pie doesn't work and that is waste. It just means we actually don't know. There's not evidence against what kind of impact that that money is going towards. Now imagine that the pie shrinks 20%, which is a fair guess given what's going on right now and what has been going on. And what's happening is that as it shrinks, everybody's getting a haircut at the same rate. Doesn't matter if you have results or not. Everybody is getting cut, and some recent research we did on this kind of bears this out. So the question is, imagine that we actually, in these austere times, with a smaller pie, could expand the amount of the pie that actually has evidence of what kind of effect it could have on the lives of kids, the lives of families, and the lives of communities. So that even with less resources, we actually could have an increase in the kind of performance and the kind of outcomes that we all care deeply about. Now, is this a pipe dream? Is this something that's even conceivable to imagine? I actually think it is, and let me give you a few reasons why. First, if you look at the last decade, one of the most remarkable things about it is the number of programs that have been built and developed that have strong evidence of impact. It's one of the real hallmarks of the last decade. A lot of these aren't household names, but they've been rigorously studied, and they're on pathways to really scale results like youth villages, and their scores more than this. A set of philanthropists like New Profit here in Boston, Edna McConnell Clark Foundation, Venture Philanthropy Partners have been critical players in investing in these kinds of programs. If you take, for example, Nurse Family Partnership at the center there, it's a program that matches poor first-time teenage pregnant mothers with a nurse 6 months while they're pregnant that stays with them through 12 months after the birth of the child, providing nutritional advice, medical support, a whole set of supports. And what are the outcomes? For that population, a 30% decrease in child abuse, a 20% decrease in the likelihood that that teenage pregnant mother will have a second child in her teenage years, which is predictive of a whole set of things related to educational attainment and employability. Interestingly, the children are in utero and 1 year old, actually 10 years out have gains in their educational outcomes of 5 to 10 percentile points. And when the Rand Corporation did a study on Nurse Family Partnership, it found that for every dollar invested, there was a $5 return. So a remarkable program like youth villages and like others on this page. Now, do we have the solutions to every issue that we face? Absolutely not. But there are programs like this that suggest we could expand that pie. We also now are seeing innovations in how money flows that suggest that we could grow the evidence-based, kind of rigorously tested part of that pie as well. First, in the Obama administration, at the beginning of the Obama administration, they launched the Social Innovation Fund. Now, this is a program that actually searches out across the country for programs like Nurse Family Partnership and Youth Villages that has strong evidence of working. And over the last 3 years, it has invested in 197 programs. Now, the way it invests also is innovative because for every government dollar, it's matched by 3 private sector dollars to support the growth and development of the program. In the federal government now, you have the Department of Labor, Department of Health and Human Services, other departments now adopting these kinds of innovation funds. And so there really is the possibility of this spreading. And in fact, the Office of Management and Budget last month issued a circular that asked every department, when it submits its 2014 budgets, to explain what evidence they are using to base their resource allocations on. So glimmers that you could actually maybe move this pie there. It's also notable that many of these ideas started in the Bush administration. And the idea of getting more money to what works is a bipartisan idea. It actually transcends political boundaries. So that is exciting to think about as you look forward. Finally, New Profit, a Boston-based nonprofit, has been critical in the development of this idea. I mean, Boston and Massachusetts is a hotbed of innovation, as you'll see, and they were critical in the design and development of the Social Innovation Fund. So we have some glimmers of hope at the federal level. At the state level in Massachusetts, Massachusetts was the first state to issue an RFP, a request for proposals for a social impact bond. Now, what a social impact bond is it takes private investors' money and invests it in a program that it aims towards prevention of some sort, And then the government savings is the return to the bondholder, if indeed that prevention occurs. So if you think about a program that focuses on people getting out of prison, and then it's a job training program to keep them from going back in prison, which happens at a very, very high rate, the bondholder gets a return based on whether or not the government saves the money of having these ex-offenders not go back to prison. Very innovative program, just at the beginning, just starting. Also, not just Massachusetts being the key state, but a series of nonprofits in Massachusetts, social finance, third sector capital, and new profit, have all been integral to developing this set of ideas. So again, you see this glimmer of hope based on the fact that there are programs in existence from that first chart that could be kind of funded and financed in this innovative way. So we have some innovations in government funding. Now in philanthropy, similarly, there are some interesting innovations. If you think about philanthropy, most philanthropy is local. Philanthropists identifying challenges in their communities and actually investing locally. And it's a powerful force for building the fabric of a community. But when you think about it, it's often the case that a given problem in a given community does not have the best solution for that problem in a community. And so the question is, under what conditions do you go out and try to find a solution that might better fit your community? And so in Boston, a philanthropist named John Simon with Margaret Hall created a philanthropy called the Greenlight Fund. And what the Greenlight Fund does is it works with local officials in Boston to identify a need, because it's not trying to duplicate things or compete with things, to identify a need, and then scours the country to try to find what's the best solution for that need and bring it to Boston. Again, a different way to finance what works. And in fact, 3 years ago, Youth Villages was the organization they brought to Boston. So we see these innovations, and the other interesting thing about Greenlight now is actually, to combine some of these threads, Greenlight just got money from the Social Innovation Fund, the first example, to expand their model to 2 other states. So we're starting to see these glimmers of what might change. But I think there is a fundamental question, because these are still quite small, and that is, how do you move these from being exotic experiments, something you talk about at TED and kind of celebrate at TED, and actually make it the way the world works? Actually make that pie grow in a fundamental way. And I think there's 3 things to do, and they involve people in this room and people like you in other places around the country. So the first thing is to stand up and say that a change is needed. Now, this may not look like the typical philanthropist or the typical activist, but in fact, we need more people doing this. When I talked to Pat Lawler about how he gets into states, one of his stories was about he and a local philanthropist repeatedly submitting applications to compete for contracts in a given state, and repeatedly losing, despite greater results, despite lower cost. And this philanthropist just couldn't figure it out. They're like, this is crazy. I've never seen anything like this. And ultimately, this philanthropist, she stormed into the Department of Social Services and berated the director, which was also a highly uncommon thing. And it ended up resulting in Youth Villages actually getting a contract. Now, I'm not advocating or suggesting that that always works. But the point is that these are political processes. People who exercise voice and demand change have influence on them. So what you personally can do with the relationships you have and the people you know is actually quite significant. Second thing you can do is actually ensure that we're funding more organizations that can help us determine what works. So you want to fund these organizations that work, but we actually need to know better what does work and what doesn't. We need to grow that list, but be clear on what's real evidence, what's real results, and what's not. For example, in Washington State, the Washington State Legislature funded an organization called the Washington State Public Policy Institute. And the Washington State Public Policy Institute analyzes different problems, looks at the solutions in a state, and makes recommendations for what works and what doesn't. And when it did this in the criminal justice field, it found the ability to generate $1.2 billion in savings over a 2-year budget cycle by a set of recommendations about moving money to what works and getting greater results. Now, this basic idea is starting to flow in other places. The Pew Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation are actually funding an initiative called Results First. And if you hear about it, please support it, advocate for it, because it's coming to Massachusetts. It'll be one of the states that they pilot this in. Because right now, everybody knows you have to say you have results. So there's no ambiguity about that. But the difference between saying you have results and actually demonstrably having them through rigorously testing is huge. And we need more capacity to distinguish those two things. Finally, the final thing to do is that we need a mass coalition, a mass constituency for what works. There's a giant constituency for the status quo, for keeping money flowing the way it is. So how do we get the money flowing towards what works? Well, we need a real constituency for this. And that ought to be a constituency that transcends party lines. There's no reason why the Democrats, the Republicans, the Tea Party, the Business Roundtable, the ACLU wouldn't be interested in advocating for this. If you care about results or you care about lower taxes and lower cost, this movement is for you. So we really need to, given the nature of this being a political process, create the occasion to get more people involved and actually influence government in a powerful way here. Now, when I shared these thoughts with a friend of mine who's a social activist, I confess that he laughed, and he said, like, this isn't like the civil rights movement. This isn't like the women's movement. I mean, you're advocating for a movement that's about data, analysis. And he just said, that just doesn't get the blood boiling. That's just not going to work. And I have to confess that there's some truth to that. But if you think behind the data about what this is about the trajectory of the lives of those kids in youth villages. This is about families being able to get living wages and get on a trajectory to create powerful, good lives. This is about strengthening communities. It's not an abstraction about data. It's about, do we use our resources at a time when it's certain they're going to be reduced in a way that drives towards results, or are we going to give everybody a haircut in the same way and go backwards? Because when you think about it, in our midst right now is the potential to actually move the needle on some of the most important problems facing some of the most challenged of our fellow citizens. We actually can do that. And I think there's people in this room and people in other rooms like this will be critical to actually fulfilling that promise. And I can't think of anything more important. Thank you.